So before we talk about your brilliant writing, we're going to talk a little bit about Buber first. I'm going to introduce Buber, and then we will spend some time talking about strategies moving forward. Good. Okay, so let's see. I need this. I don't know. Yeah, it's fine. It feels slanted, but it's okay. It's so weird. You'll see when you watch the recording. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to introduce Buber. I'm going to look at his biography. I'm going to look at the political context of his writing. It's very important. And then I want to look at the way he does philosophy, because we are now switching into existentialism and phenomenology, and we need to know a little bit about that because it's a whole different way of thinking. Okay. So Buber, 1878 to 1965, born in Vienna to an Orthodox Jewish family. So he spent much of his childhood in the house of his grandfather, Solomon Buber, who was a renowned scholar. He was a Jewish studies scholar. So he was kind of spent his life surrounded by books, pertaining to Jewish studies. But when he became a teenager, he had a kind of religious crisis. So he kind of broke away from Jewish religion, Jewish customs, and he started to read people we know. He started to read Kant. He started to read Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and we'll see a lot of Kant and Nietzsche. In Buber, right? There's a really heavy influence of Kant. It's almost the same thing, but worded differently. So so it's good we did Kant first, because now we're ready for Buber. So he kind of finds his way back to Judaism, but through the mystical movement, mystical branch of Judaism called Hasidism. There was a kind of revival in Eastern Europe, in Judaism at the time. And this revival was led by a few prominent rabbis. They were kind of stars, right? The star rabbis, like you have nowadays, you have star evangelists, right? Like Joel Osteen and all this gang over here in the US, right? You had the same thing going on over there. You had rabbis that were really very charismatic, had huge followings. And these rabbis really, their attempt was to really renew Judaism from within. And one of the ways they did that was to emphasize the emotions, right? If you're familiar with Jewish practice, it's very intellectual. It's very, we study the law, we study the text, and we make, we look at it with our intelligence. So the intelligence is really privileged in the Jewish faith. But they said, well, we are missing the emotional component, and we need to claim that again. We need to go back to the kind of the feelings, the encounter with God, not just the study of the text, but the actual one-on-one personal encounter with the divine. And they also emphasized dance, poetry, right? They would tell stories or parables instead of writing treatises. So kind of it's the equivalent in Judaism of, if you're familiar, of Sufism in Islam, right? The same idea, same approach to faith. So he kind of, really liked that approach, and he ended up translating a number of stories, Hasidic stories that we still have today, translated by Buber, kind of making it accessible to us. So it goes back into Judaism, continues philosophy, of course. In 1923 is when he wrote our book, and we have to know the political climate that gave rise to this book, right? And then in 1933, right, he's, at this point, he's teaching in Germany, in Frankfurt, and of course, what happened in 1933 in Germany? Anybody remember?
The Nazis came to power.
Yeah, the Nazis came to power, and of course, one of the first things they did is to look up all the Jewish professors and forbid them to teach. So he wasn't the only one. There's a number of people we know, like Husserl. Also, if you're familiar with Edmund Husserl, who was the master of Heidegger, forbidden to teach, right? A number of Jewish professors were. So he kind of immediately is sensing the atmosphere and is smart enough to move to Israel at that time. So he doesn't stick it out very long. He moves in 1938 to Jerusalem, and then ends up teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And then becomes, of course, very prominent, teachers in the US and Europe and so forth, becomes very well known. So if you're interested in the Palestinian conflict, he has written amazing essays, critical essays with regards to, not critical like we do today, but really beautiful essays on how on a Jewish perspective with regards to the Palestinian conflict. where he really looks into what does it mean to be Jewish, what does it mean to be a Jewish nation, what should be our connection with the stranger, with the other. And he really, I find it beautiful that he really, he's of course, he would be today for either a two-state solution or a one-state solution where both are coexisting, right? That was his goal. But he really believed that it was possible to really have, that it was essential to do the Jewish psyche to welcome the stranger, right? This is actually, we'll see when we study Levinas, how crucial this idea is of living with the stranger, of connecting to the stranger. And so he draws on these Jewish traditions and applies it here to the Palestinian conflict. Says, can we not try to coexist and live with, and very critical with regards to the governmental policies of his time and so forth. So it's very interesting. He wrote a number of essays like that, but of course, we're gonna look at his philosophy. So let me talk a little bit about the political context that gave rise to this work. So we're in the late 19th century. So it's not just early 20th century, which is World War I. Obviously, this influences his work, but it's also the movements in the late 19th century, which can be termed the movements of materialism. There is a trend in the late 19th century towards understanding everything from the perspective of matter. In other words, and this is under the influence of people like Marx, like Freud. We are also under the influence of the scientific revolution. We are more and more thinking, you know, we are nothing more than our biology, our molecular makeup. There is no soul or spirit or anything like that floating around, right? And this is, of course, you can find this, this idea is everywhere, right? This idea that we're nothing more than just biology. You find this in Freud, right? Where Freud demolishes the idea of the soul, right? You find this in science, right? Darwinist science, which says, oh, we're just evolving, you know, by chance. You find this in biology in general, where they start to explain everything based on science. So you fall in love, but it's nothing but this chemical reaction in your brain, right? So, so we can see, right, that there is a rise in the idea that, and even today, some of us will think like this still. I mean, this is, of course, one of the dominant ideologies nowadays. Remember when we talked about ethics and we were saying, right, there's a higher realm that is dictating our actions. And some of you were saying, well, no, it's still instinct, right? Saving that person because instinctually you feel, you know, it's good for the tribe and you want to protect the tribe. And so we're doing everything based on survival, right? This is part of the trend of materialism, that there's nothing above. There's no noumenal. That's materialism. There's no noumenal realm, just a phenomenal realm. Right? And so he is reacting to that, right? He's saying, no, he's one of the philosophers who will try to argue for this noumenal dimension. And we'll see that for, just like Kant, he will situate the noumenal dimension in the human being again, right? The human being is the bearer of the noumenal dimension. We are the ones who have this, who contain this dimension, who are more than just matter. Right, so we'll see that he follows in the footsteps of Kant here, right? Remember, Kant said that the good is found in us, right? Let me reiterate that argument because we're going to talk about it again. Remember how I mentioned when we talked about the good in Kant, and I asked you, where is the good, right? Anybody answer? Let's remember, where is the good for Kant? Yes.
In all of us, in our goodwill.
It's not in our goodwill, actually.
No reason.
It's not how I explained it, but no, it's not even there, right? It's not something in it. It's something that is revealed in a certain way, right? The good is not sitting here waiting to, there is something that we have to do to reveal the good. But you know what it is? To reveal the good in each other. So it's not just sitting there, right? Existing by itself. It exists when we act a certain way, it comes into being. It is unveiled. What is this way we have to act with each other to unveil the good in the other person? Yes.
I believe you said that we have to keep the dignity by acting as if we were a human being and not an object.
Exactly. When I treat Wu as an object, his good is not revealed at that moment. He's just, right, reduced to an object. But when I treat Wu with respect, and I don't treat him as an object, now all of a sudden I'm revealing something about Wu that is different from all objects in the room, correct? I'm revealing the good in itself, not just good for something, You see the distinction? This is really important, right? Every object in the room is good for something, right? But because I'm using it and discarding it, so this is good for something, this is good for something, this is good for something. But Wu, I cannot just use him and discard him. And the moment I step back and don't use him and discard him, I'm revealing that he is different. There's something different about Wu than about my phone, my bottle, my plant, right? And at that moment, I'm revealing something of the noumenal in Wu. There's something beyond the phenomenal, beyond instinct. There's something that appears, which is, you're really on the spot there. You're shining now with everything that I said, right? There's something in Wu which is good in itself, right? And so remember, the good is not sitting there, because if I'm using Wu, and if he becomes like a slave, it will not be revealed. You see what I mean? So for Kant, of course, we all have reason, but that's different. The good is something else. The good is accessed through this behavior. Or do you get me? Okay, so I'm saying this because I'm gonna Buber is gonna go in the same direction, but we have to understand the nature of the argument. Okay, so we are in a world now where more and more the whole noumenal realm is not believed in anymore. People don't think it exists. There is only the phenomenal, instinct, materiality. There is nothing else in life to look for, and you will see this, and then happiness. We're going to see this in the political systems, right? But materialism says this: there is nothing more in life than happiness, and getting this happiness any way we can. Material happiness is the goal in materialism, right? Now, there are two political trends which adopt this idea. Anybody know what they are? They were very powerful during Buber's time. Two political trends that are enemies, but actually think the same. Dig a little. What's the one? What's the two main? Think Cold War. What were the two? Yes.
Like capitalism and Marxism.
Yes, exactly. Right. These were the two main trends, right? Of course, Nazism pops up, like like a virus, right, in the middle of it. But you had these two main trends were socialism, right, or Marxism, and capitalism. And we're going to see that actually both, even though they're always pitted against each other, saying one is better than the other, both actually are deeply materialistic theories. Let's look at socialism. What is the goal of socialism? When you watch the propaganda movies of the Soviet Union or of Cuba, what are they talking about? Anybody watch? They're great. You should look them up. The propaganda movies of the USSR and Cuba, which same system. Anybody watch any of those movies? Oh, I should give you some links to that. Well, I'll tell you. So I watched one once. I think it was a Cuban one. You always begins like this. The sun rises, right? And you have like this couple, right? A man and a woman, obviously. And they're both healthy and young and really, upbeat. And they're going to work in the farm, right? And they're really excited about it. And they're carrying their tools and you're laughing. Is there Chinese propaganda movies like that? Right? They're going to work with their tools. And this is systematic, right? Russian and Cuban. And they're, and then you hear in the background this choir of voices, right? Of really very, energetic voices. And, basically you're working for the lands, you're working for the people, you're building the country, the nation, the fatherland, the motherland, whatever. And everybody's excited about being part of this grand project of what? What's the goal? Of this going to, farm. And what is the ultimate goal of this big project that these people are working on?
The good of the civilization.
The what?
For the good of the civilization.
Yeah, there's not even civilization. It's just the food, right? Yes. Yeah, exactly, right? They're looking for material prosperity, material happiness, right? This is the goal of socialism. If you read anybody like Marx, he's talking about eventually we'll get to the point where everyone will be wealthy, period. That's all that we want. Everyone will have equal access to the land, equal access to property, equal access to resources. This is the highest goal of socialism. Now, what would Kant say about that? What's missing in this highest goal? That we'll all have a piece of the pie. It's great, by the way. I think it's great. But what's missing in this whole idea that the highest goal is for all of us to have a piece of the pie? At any cost, by the way. That's how it worked over there. At any cost.
Individualism?
Huh?
Individualism?
So yes, on the one hand, right, yes, go ahead.
You're using everyone as means.
Okay, so yes, that's what Buber is sensing, right? Everyone is just, a cog, right? A part of the big enterprise, right? And everyone is just a means to this grandiose end of having material prosperity. The other problem, in addition to this, is that the highest goal is happiness. And philosophers cannot be satisfied with that, right? How can the highest goal be just to feed and like animals, right? Highest goal should be something higher than happiness. Kant would agree, right? Highest goal should be maybe encounter, or like Kant would say, moral, right? The moral dimension, right? So in the system of socialism, this is a purely materialistic system where the highest goal is material happiness at the price of individualism, at the price, more specifically and more dangerously, at the price of spirit, of intellectual freedom, of intellectual exercise, right? And I'll give you an example of this. So there was a composer in the time of Stalin called Shostakovich. Anybody familiar with Shostakovich? Any music majors? Shostakovich was an orchestral composer. And he lived exactly at the time of Stalin. And during Stalin, of course, it was this upbeat time of building the country, but at the same time, everybody was freaking out because Stalin was a little crazy. He could flip out all of a sudden and throw everybody in a gulag, right? So he was a little crazy, a little unstable, but people were still trying. And there was this composer, and he was supposed to compose for the nation. And of course, Stalin was expecting him to compose happy, upbeat music, right? Now, Shostakovich was a very anxious man, and he was resonating with the dominant anxiety of everybody, right? Because at any moment under Stalin, the Gestapo could come to your door, take you out of your bed, and send you to a work camp in Siberia, right? Which is basically no man's land, right? So at any moment, if you were suspected of anything, right, you could be shipped out. So people lived in anguish, and Shostakovich was tapping into this anguish, and so all he could compose is anxious music, right? And so Stalin would be like, compose something for us. And Shostakovich would come up with this anxious, dissonant sounding music. If you've heard a little bit of 20th century classical, it's just, he couldn't do it. He couldn't write happy music, right? And Stalin got angry. He's like, will you stop? I'm gonna send you to the gulags if you continue like this. And so he told him, you need to compose something upbeat or else, right? And so Shostakovich goes back home, and he's like, and then he comes up with an idea. And it's very interesting. He composes the war symphonies. And war symphony normally is supposed to be kind of showing it's usually with a lot of brass. It's very pompous, and it's really celebrating war and celebrating the leader, right? So he writes these war symphonies, but he writes them with irony. So he'll have a big brass, right, big band music. All of a sudden you have this trumpet, right, all by itself. I'm just remembering the score. And the trumpet is playing, and literally that's what's on the music, right? So it's like there's this climax, and then there's these drops, right? So if you have a dirty mind, you know what he's alluding to, and you know how he's actually criticizing Stalin, right? He's basically saying, right, and he made the symphony sound very pompous, very majestic, but at the same time, he had all these moments in the music that were anticlimactic, that were going against the pomp. But Stalin was so uneducated, he didn't notice. So he's sitting in the concert, and he's like, yeah, big band music, and he doesn't get all the different layers where he's actually making fun of him and making him look like basically, he's a little impotent, right? So that's what's going on musically in the score. When you have this kind of drops, right? You have a violin, right? And it's the whole time you have allusions to this, right? So he's kind of making fun of him, but Stalin, of course, didn't notice, thank God. So that's to give you an idea, right? You did not have the right to express what you were feeling or thinking if it was going against the major project of the land, right? And so this was the problem. Right? There's no room for spirit, for the human spirit. You cannot be anxious. You cannot ask questions. You cannot criticize. You cannot, have any type of, religious connection. This was all forbidden, right? During the time of Stalin and so forth, Christians and Jews were persecuted, right? Because there was this connection with something higher, right? So this is the first materialist political context that Buber is responding to. But then if we turn to ourselves, we'll see there's the same problem. Let's look at capitalism. So yes, in capitalism, we have individualism, we have free speech, we have all kinds of freedoms, but how is it also a deeply materialistic ideology, capitalism? even though we have this kind of front, right, that we can think and we can, you know, do what we want, it is still very much a anti-spirit on many levels, and it's still very much deeply materialistic ideology. Who can help me? What's the goal of capitalism? What's the goal of most people in this country?
Get rich.
Yes, okay, absolutely. Capitalism, accumulate capital. Why? Get wealthy. Why? That's it. There's no why. That's the end, right? So we have the same mentality. In fact, if I ask, I used to do that, now you know, but if I ask, when I ask my, the baby classes, right? And I ask them, they don't know they're about to get tricked. So this is the 100s, right? I'm like, okay, so what's your guys' goal in life, right? Most of them will tell you, I want to make money. I want to have a nice house. I want to have a career. And I want, right? Most of our goals are materialistic goals, right? So what we're seeing is seeing this too on the Western side, right? That the goals there are nothing but I want to be wealthy. And when I mean, and even look at, you know, all these scam projects, pyramid projects, all the same promise, you will be wealthy like you. Anybody talk to any of these people? We're going to tell you, if you do this, you will be wealthy. And I mean, we have so many books, Become a Millionaire in 3 months. Like we, this country, right, is really about that, right? And Buber is sensing there's a problem here too. If the highest goal is wealth, and what are we sacrificing on the way to this wealth? What are we losing? What are we forgetting? That's what this book is about, right? I and thou. So he's noticing, and you'll see the terminology, there are two ways that we are in distorted relationships with ourselves and with others. In socialism, we are in what Buber calls an I-it relationship. I-it, that's how he terms it. I-it, meaning the self is a means to an end in socialism, right? The individuals are only there to work for the national project. And don't try to think different and act different and compose different, just blend in, please. Right? Blend in and we'll get somewhere, right? Don't try to be original and creative and critical. We don't need this, right? We need this thing to get going and to get done. And we cannot have all these critical and, you know, creative people. We need everyone to be on the same page. Makes sense, makes total sense, right? So, but I-it, right? The I is an it, right? We are dealing, people are considered as it, meaning objects, meaning means to an end, right? Okay. Capitalism, Buber would call the I-I relationship. There is only the I, right? The I is at the center. And look even at the way that we have framed, even is it in the Constitution where we say that we are all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Where is this? Is that in the Constitution? The what declaration? Okay, great. Declaration of what? Declaration of Independence? Okay, thank you. The Declaration of Independence, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for who? Yes, but actually?
White men?
Huh?
White men?
Yes, for sure, right? This was written not to protect others. It was written to protect the property owners of the time because there was rioting going on, right? It was chaos at the time during the War of Independence. You had a very wealthy elites, and then you had the scum, which today has become what we call the white trash. This is the continuation of this. You had these two in the white population, right? You had the very wealthy elites, and then you had a bunch of, you know, people who were who were slaves, who were coming from criminal backgrounds and so forth. And so there was a lot of violence and rioting. And so when these elites wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were protecting themselves. Right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The state is there to protect my interest. Even though it says all men, it actually says us. Right? This is not all men. Right? And I'm not even talking about the Native Americans and the slavery that was going on, that was rampant and so forth. Right? Even within the white population, it was only this elite that was being protected. Still today, we see the government as supposed to protect me, not them. And as soon as the government trying to protect them, ooh, we're socialists, right? Do you notice this? Have you ever thought about this? That we tend to see the government as an entity that is supposed to protect my rights. But when the government starts to talk about other people's rights, we freak out and we're like, oh, we're becoming socialists, right? This is interesting for me to hear when I'm listening, right, to the discourse in this country. So we are still in this country very much focused on the self and on the rights of the self. But there's very little discourse on the rights of the other, right? When are we going to talk about the rights of the immigrant? Right? When are we going to talk about the rights of Native Americans? When are we going to talk about, right? We tend to talk about just the rights of whoever is in power, right? So this is an I for Buber. The self is at the center, and there is no other in this context. In the context we live in, political context we live in, there is really no discourse, no serious discourse on the rights of the stranger or the foreigner, right? We are really thinking that the government is there to protect us. So both for Buber, both